Yes, I'd love to. There's so much to say about the vintage Kenner Star Wars line, and I'm by far not the most qualified person to speak on it, but I'm gonna have a lot of fun trying. Also, if you haven't watched it already, the Toys That Made Us episode about this line is freaking amazing. Okay, so just the creation of this line has such a crazy backstory. It's arguably one of the most successful toy lines. Just for perspective, the Star Wars toys have made more money than all of the films have made in revenue combined. So basically, Lucasfilm starts shopping around the toy line for the movie before it comes out. Everyone's turning down this toy line. It finally comes across the desk of Kenner, who accepts the line, but they only have a couple of months before the movie comes out, so they immediately get to work on it without having a contract for it or anything. So the artists just start going. So the initial challenge of working on this line was that all of the toys at the time were like Barbie sized. So this creates an issue for Kenner in terms of scale if they're looking at building out a toy line, where it's important to include all of the ships and vehicles and creatures and playsets. So they kind of just decided on a whim to make the scale this 3 3/4 scale, which I think is one of the most interesting things about this line, is the fact that they're just off the cusp choice of 3 3/4 made every other toy line in the 80s just like switch to 3 3/4 format. So 1 month before the movie comes out, Kenner and Lucasfilm finally come to an agreement about the contract, and Kenner gets this insane deal. They get 95% of the toy revenue. As long as they pay Lucasfilms $10K a year, the contract is binding forever. Which, considering what I just said about how well this line did, is absolutely bonkers. So movie comes out in May of 1977. Obviously, the toys were not ready yet. So the movie's this massive success, and the toy line doesn't come out until spring of the following year, which includes the original 12 figures along with some vehicles and playsets. Toy line is a massive success, like through the freaking roof. But after this initial wave comes out, they don't release any new designs for another 2 years, which is in 1983 when Return of the Jedi comes out and we get my boy, the Gamorrean Guard.
Return of the Jedi. The Rancor monster has trapped Luke Skywalker. Can he escape the Rancor's claws as the Rancor Keeper and Gamorrean Guard look on? Luke's only chance is a stake in the monster's jaw. Will he succeed or fall victim? Only you can decide with Star Wars toys.
And I'm going to have to do a part 2 where I follow up with the rest of the Kenner story and my obsession with the Gamorrean Guards. Here we go, part 2, focusing more on the Gamorrean Guards. Needless to say, I army build this figure. Typically, when you pick a figure to do an army build, you want to pick a figure that is fairly common and easy to acquire mass amounts of, and also a figure that it makes sense for it to be in an army. So for instance, a Gamorrean Guard army makes sense, or a Stormtrooper army is in army build. But say you were to collect multiples of Boba Fett's, that's no longer considered an army build. That is called a focus. So an interesting side effect of army building is you start to see all of this variation between the individual figures within your army, primarily with these being the color and the paint. So in the case of vintage Star Wars, that largely has to do with the country of origin where the figure was manufactured. So Kenner would outsource their manufacturing to several different places. And what I'm showing you here are the different manufacturing stamps on the individual figures, even though they were all made in 1983. And here we have a lovely carded figure. This one's a little beat up, but it was generously gifted to me by a friend of mine, so he's happily living here with the collection. Really nice card art on this, and here you can see on the back there's the bulk of the figures at this point, all laid out here so you can make your little checklist, make sure you got them all. And here's a little close-up on our boy looking real good. I chose the Gamorrean Guard to army build because, let's be honest, he's just so freaking cute. Like, how do you resist this beautiful bod? Gamorreans are a matriarchal society with the women running their society while men basically just run around waging wars, with many Gamorreans working as basically a private military company for Jabba the Hutt. So as I mentioned before in the last video, this line was incredibly well received. Everybody freaking loved it. The toys were flying off the shelves, which of course made a huge market for bootlegs. And I have to say, as a collector, some of my favorite toys out there from the 80s are just straight up Star Wars bootlegs. Some honorable mentions from my personal collection are the Staroid Raiders, which just such an awesome design. I love them so much. Also, just the straight up Star Raiders line, also by Tomlin, such a solid line. We also got Star Team with their fake 3PO over there, and this really fun Vader. And I don't own any personally because they are exceedingly expensive, but the Uze line from Turkey, incredible. This guy's calculator control panel, I can't. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Kenner's probably my favorite 80s toy company. But their story comes to a sad end, with Star Wars being the bread and butter of the company. Once the original trilogy is over, they're struggling to produce Star Wars toys that kids were still interested in. And their other properties just weren't making enough money. So they end up having to close their doors with no hope in sight of George reviving the franchise. And here's the last big plot twist I'll leave you guys with. Kenner goes under, Hasbro buys it, but with George not making any movies, they don't make any Star Wars toys. But remember the caveat I told you in the last video where to keep the rights to the Star Wars contract, the company who's producing the toys has to pay Lucasfilms $10K a year? Basically the best deal ever made for a property ever in the history of toy manufacturing. Well, Hasbro doesn't see this and doesn't pay Lucasfilm. So they're in breach of contract, goes back into negotiations with Lucasfilm, and they're like, F you guys. Like, they're going so hard on this new contract. Hasbro ends up getting this awful deal just to keep Star Wars. And as soon as the deal's made, George announces the prequels trilogy.